Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am joined again by Ruminations and Master Sanders to discuss the legality of the American Revolution within the context of the legal disputes of Coke and Blackstone. So, Ruminations, why don't you set this up for us?
The background for this discussion has to take into account the fact that the American Revolution is often presented in the popular culture as being a fight for republicanism or democracy against monarchy. This is, I believe, a misconception, or at least an exaggeration. And in order to understand why that is, one must take into account the legal situation and realities of the time. Prior to the American Revolution, there was a system in England, or a reality in England, after the Tudor period, in which the British Parliament had some recognized prerogatives. The king or the monarchy had some recognized prerogatives. And the courts also had some prerogatives. In order to understand, one might point to the American system of divided powers, which was indeed influenced by this English system. Perhaps somewhat more contentiously, Edward Coke, who was a renowned jurist in the 17th century in England, said that also the English common law was binding on the Parliament, the king, and on the courts. So, in other words, a Parliament could not, for example, pass a law denying British subjects the right to bear arms, provided that one understands that to be part of the British common law, which Coke did. Now, these distinctions were not entirely settled on. They were not entirely honored. As is not surprising, the Parliament liked to arrogate more power to itself. Likewise, the monarchy liked to arrogate more power to itself, and this is something that ultimately led to the English Civil War in the 17th century. After the at the end of the 17th century, something called the Glorious Revolution took place, in which that the Parliament was supreme, that the king and Parliament, to use Blackstone's terminology, Blackstone being the legal figure to succeed Coke. In his words, Parliament could do anything not in violation of the laws of nature. This is to say, Parliament could not say that it's going to rain and then it would rain, but Parliament could tell any citizen when to jump and how high to jump, provided that it had the king's consent. And indeed, very quickly, from the time of Queen Anne onward, it became the reality that indeed the monarch's consent was a given, presumed aspect of English politics. And so here you have a distinction, contrast between the pre-Glorious Revolution understanding a la Edward Coke of divided powers versus the post-Glorious Revolution understanding of William Blackstone, which holds to the theory of parliamentary sovereignty, which incidentally is the legal philosophy that is currently prevalent and universal in English legal thinking. The American Revolution provides an interesting upset of this arrangement that's been arrived at by the end or by the beginning of the 18th century, in that what you have in the colonies are separate legislatures. And for reasons of travel, at the time, it's not possible for the colonists to have representation in the British Parliament. The British believe that, generally speaking, that the British Parliament being supreme, it still has jurisdiction over the American colonies. The American colonists, by contrast, believe that that prerogative rests in their local legislatures, at least the ones who go on to become the American revolutionaries. This, as I understand it, this understanding of exactly which legislative body is truly in its rights within the context represents the basis of the legal question of the American Revolution. Ironically, contrary to the rhetoric, even rhetoric used at the time, the British, far from being Tories, were actually upholding the Whig interpretation of the law, which emphasized the supremacy of the British Parliament. By contrast, the Americans, by believing that all they shared in common with the British was a common king, and that under this king they had their own various parliamentary bodies, were actually looking backward toward the Kochian and outdated version of British constitutional thinking, meaning that even if it might be too far to say that the Americans were the conservatives and the English the liberals, I think acknowledge that both sides were fighting for a different kind of liberalism. But I think that a strong case can be made that for the idea that the Americans were indeed fighting for the older kind of liberalism. However, this says nothing about the extent to which their legal case was or was not the correct one.
Okay, Master Sanders, thoughts?
Well, to kind of elaborate on what he said, the arguments that were made by many of the early patriots were actually quite amusing in retrospect. There's a great book by Eric Nelson called The Royalist Revolution, where he examines a lot of the more royalist tendencies that existed among the American patriots prior to and following the American Revolution. Now, it's interesting, you're talking about the Whigs. One of the early terminology for those that supported independence was Whig, and of course the term those that supported more of a loyalist stance were called Tories, which ironically, as even Nelson points out, that the labels are not helpful because in many ways they articulated arguments that were actually opposite of the other. So, for example, the Whigs, who also went by the term patriot, and patriot referring to not so much love of country as it was love of a particular faction within Parliament that were British imperialists. The thrust of many of the arguments from many of the patriots going into the actual independence was that not just the fact that these colonies had their own legislatures and that these legislatures were had authority over the colony. It went one step further, saying that the only person that had a prerogative in terms of colonial governance was the king. So they would make the argument that, well, the charters are not made with Parliament, but are made with the king. And that was sort of an accident of history and given certain circumstances, but that was the thrust of their argument. And many of them, or some of them, would go to the extent of saying that the Stuarts gave them more political liberty than their current regime in Parliament. Now, there was some truth to this, of course. The Navigation Acts were passed during the time of Cromwell, and were it not for a number of different regime changes, so to speak, between the English Civil War and the imperial crisis of the 1760s, it's probably what ultimately prevented Parliament from exercising that level of authority that would have otherwise been accepted. But nevertheless, many of the patriots or early patriots argued arguments that were closer to Tory or Stuart or pro-Stuart arguments, and most of the time, even leading up to 1775, you had the patriots insisting that they were monarchists. You know, you had George Washington toasting the king's health every night during the siege of Boston. You had the Second Continental Congress sending a petition to the king known as the Olive Branch Petition, begging for his intervention. And even people like Sam Adams were chanting slogans saying, "For God, Pitt and for King Pitt and country," referencing William Pitt, of course. So it is quite interesting to see how those arguments played out, and how ultimately the American Revolutionary stance would take a decidedly un-Tory stance when it came to the development of the U.S. Constitution and republicanism. But I assume we'll talk about that in just a bit.
So to be clear, right, Ruminations, what you're saying is that in the light of Blackstone, which creates a kind of parliamentary supremacy, the Patriots were advocating for a Kochian model, which was older and appealing to the king to intervene against Parliament. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, yeah, because that is interesting. And I do know. I think there was a incident where Ben Franklin was. This is before war had been declared, but was in England negotiating with the royalists or something, and one royalist said to Ben Franklin, the king would hate to shed the blood of his American subjects, and Ben Franklin said, well, if our negotiations are successful, we can spare the king such an exigency. And I'm like, so yeah, even Ben Franklin was like, we don't really want the king to come over here to kill all of us. But and I think one thing that's sort of a backdrop to this is the benign neglect from 1700 to 1750, where the colonies were largely autonomous. Some of that was probably due to England's wars in Europe. That time overlaps with the War of Spanish Succession, which lasted for 12, 15 years. It was a very long conflict. Of course, then there were the 7 Years' War, which, of course, immediately afterwards we have the crisis with the colonies. And of course, what's tied up in this is the fact that once the French are expelled from North America, and the nearest threat to the colonial from the 13 colonies from a foreign power would be Spain in Louisiana or Florida, they don't really feel the need for the government anymore because the French are gone. The Indian raids the French incited were largely dealt with. And they were thinking, well, look, you're asking more of us now when we need you less.
I think that that is correct, that there is a kind of dissonance between the rhetoric that the Americans use and the initial case that they make against the activities of Parliament. As Master Sanders pointed out, they actually were active in many cases in petitioning the king to exercise the then outmoded monarchical or executive veto against Parliament. And indeed, much of their rhetoric was actually monarchical. And indeed, during the first meetings of the people who would eventually go on to become the leaders in the American Revolution, they were well nigh universal in terms of their expression of pro-monarchical sentiment. My take is that the rhetoric of republicanism and of anti-monarchical, democratic rhetoric was just that it was mostly rhetoric and largely terms of convenience that I think were meant to ride what was in vogue at the time. I think it was meant to ride the wave of the forces that would eventually lead to the French Revolution. It was meant to be in line with the what was being said by the philosophes. It was, in other words, an exercise in trendiness and convenience for the purpose of making the revolution, the separation, more likely and more inspired, and providing a framework of justification when it became clear that the previous more legalistic Kochian explanation of how their grievances should be addressed was clearly failing.
Another interesting point too is that after the revolution, when you had the Constitutional Convention, the Federalists, headed up by Alexander Hamilton, wanted So, in the classical construction of a republic, there's a monarchical, democratic, and aristocratic element. And that was generally that classical mindset was what the founders were using. And Hamilton and the Federalists wanted to create a stronger executive, which everybody understood to be the sort of pseudo monarch system. And that struggle between a more sort of democratic Jeffersonian republic versus a more centralized monarchical republic of Hamilton sort of played out throughout the next 150 years. But even after the revolution, there's still this tendency towards a monarchical spirit. So what are your thoughts on that, right? Ruminations.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that I suppose I would disagree with what Master Sanders has implied, in that I don't really think that they necessarily took things in a direction after the revolution that would seem to contradict their pro-monarchical sentiment, because what the Americans eventually arranged for themselves was something very similar to the relationship that they wanted with the British in the first place. That is, they created a distant government with divided powers, which was limited in terms of its ability to legislate for each of the states, and had an executive veto and had judicial review, and in which it was clear that Congress and the Senate were not sovereign, or were not supreme in the same way that the English Parliament came to be thought of. And so in this sense, I would say that the American Revolution was a movement in practice in the direction of if not in monarchical, then you might say at least elementally more tolerant of monarchy kind of arrangement. And I think that you see the fruits of this down to today, in that if you look at the nominally monarchical English system of government, it is essentially an absolute representative democracy. And if you look at the American system, it is indeed a system which, although Republican, formally speaking, does contain an element of the monarchical element that is outlined in the Aristotelian outline of government, in that the executive still does have the right to exercise a presidential veto, and indeed has made recent use of that, both by way of threat and by actively using it in recent years. And indeed, it's an actual practicing function of the American system of government. And for this reason, I believe that the sentiment and the earlier rhetoric in favor of the Kochian and relatively monarchical approach to English politics was not overridden by the advancing Republican rhetoric, but indeed did remain in practice the trajectory which America was following.
Master Sanders.
Well, I agree actually with everything you just said there. I think maybe I should have clarified what I meant. The anti-monarchical sentiment was much more, as you mentioned, rhetorical than it was in actual practice. Because if you look at the Constitution, as you mentioned, there's much more of a monarchical element than even in Britain today, in practically speaking. In fact, upon assuming office, George Washington had more formal power than King George III ever had. Now, we do know in history that while the rhetoric of something such as the Declaration of Independence may seem to have exaggerated, at least at the time, the culpability of the monarch, we do know that King George III did attempt to rule through Parliament. But nevertheless, most of his rule was not so much through his prerogatives as it was through a more informal sense of bribery and influence, than as opposed to George Washington, who did have a lot of formally invested power. Here's something that George Washington could do that George III could not. President Washington could pick his ministers. something that George III typically could not formally. Also, President Washington could veto laws passed by Congress. I think, as you pointed out, right, Ruminations, is that since the reign of Queen Anne, no monarch has exercised the royal prerogative to veto, and it's just basically been a rubber stamp for Parliament. And so, oh, of course, and in the United States, we typically don't like to hate our president. It's usually a big deal if a president goes below 35% in terms of approval ratings, and American presidents tend to be reelected. So as Americans, we never really quite shook off that monarchical aspect, and arguably, again, the American presidency is far more a monarchical institution than the monarch at the time was. And so I would actually agree with you, right, Ruminations, is that in many ways the American presidency, as outlined in Article 2, was in many ways an attempt to correct the excesses of parliamentary supremacy that they perceived was a problem in the lead up to independence.
Well, what's interesting is that I think you're onto something here, right, Ruminations, when you say that there's the tendency to overplay the sort of radical republicanism of the American Revolution. So, for example, if we look at the French Revolution, where there was a truly radical republicanism, it led to a sweeping away of the old order, the execution of the king, the execution of the aristocrats, a new calendar, a new social system. Everything was just upended in the name of the revolution. Whereas the Latin American historian scholar Carlos Rangel, in his 1976 book, The United States and the Latin Americas, he points out that the American Revolution was, from his point of view as a Venezuelan man of letters, very much a conservative movement, in the sense that even unlike his own revolutions in Latin America, we were not trying to produce a new social system. So like with Bolivar and Martin and the Troubadour, they were trying to dissolve the aristocracy, the church, and the Spanish viceroy. Whereas in the United States, in large part, I think due to benign neglect, there were organic institutions. And they saw those organic institutions as under threat by the king, or rather by Parliament. And they were seeking to defend those already organic institutions. And I think this is really the key element here, on what renders a revolution radical or not. Does a revolution lead to a complete restructuring of the society, or does it lead to the preservation of an already existing order? So in this regards as well, the Confederacy and the American Civil War was also a conservative effort in that it was seeking to maintain an already existing way of life. And so I do think that element of radicalism, where the American Revolution is compared to the French or Latin American revolutions, is a mistake. In large part because it wasn't really trying to do anything new at all. As you pointed out, it was making an appeal to an older legal precedent.
Well, I do anticipate some people who are both pro and anti-American revolution pointing out that there were claims to the contrary, that after all, the rhetoric in the Declaration of Independence does sort of have the flavor of being a kind of supporting a kind of radical Lockean revolution. And likewise, you have in the Philadelphia Convention, I mean, if we're being honest about it, they were getting together and thinking, well, how should we arrange the new society? What kind of arrangement do we want? And indeed, there were radical proposals, like James Madison in the Virginia Plan actually suggested that indeed the states should should be redrawn. Along lines of population, and indeed there should be a federal veto over all state laws. He was supporting a kind of imperial government. which is directly in contradiction to the kind of myth of James Madison as the creator of the American Constitution. Actually, every one of his suggestions at the Philadelphia Convention was struck down. The only suggestion of Madison's that was followed was that there be a Constitution and a Philadelphia Convention. Even the Bill of Rights was something that he didn't want in there. But but the point I think is that you can look at what they said, but people say all manner of things, and they said whatever was convenient. And obviously, when you're reforming a political arrangement, you're going to have everybody's pet idea rising to the surface and being given voice. But the question is not what did this or that thinker say and may or may not have meant at a given time, but the real question is what did they do collectively? And it seems to me that what they did is markedly more conservative than what they said. And I can think of a perfect example of this. John Adams wrote a book called, I think it was called A Defense of the Constitution. I can't remember. My mind is kind of blurry on that point at the moment. But it's a work by Adams that basically is laying out a defense of the United States Constitution. And in it, he makes exactly the argument that you made earlier, Todd, and that I built on, which is that there is this Aristotelian and English principle of the one, the few, and the many, and that you see this in Congress. The many, and the Senate representing the few, and in the president representing the one. Now, the Jeffersonian Democrats, along with Madison, condemned this and said, bah, this has nothing to do with America. This is outdated. It's British. We're a republic now. But the irony, of course, is that it was actually that understanding of divided powers and of a kind of implicit institutional hierarchy, that it was actually the Jeffersonian Democrats who were better at defending that traditional sense of order in the American context than Adams was, even though Adams was the one explicitly advocating for that principle. So I think it's important that we look at what they did rather than what they said.
Well, this is also an interesting point to be made as well. If we view the Virginia constitutional founders like Jefferson as representing the more aristocratic / democratic element, because while Jefferson spoke of the natural aristocracy, he also spoke of the yeoman farmer. He certainly, and today, more democratic elements, people like Noam Chomsky or the late Christopher Hitchens, would tend to invoke Jefferson in the more democratic context. And from the Southern think tank, I think it's the Asbury Institute, they've talked about how Switzerland was a sort of European export of the Abbeville Institute.
I think that's the Abbeville Institute.
Yeah. They said that the Jeffersonian model from around 1800 to 1860 was exported to Switzerland. And now, of course, they have direct democracy. And even the arch monarchist Bill Lynn considers them one of the most base countries in Europe. So it is interesting that to the extent that the United States has embraced the more monarchical Hamiltonian federalist element, it's received criticism from a lot of these far-right monarchist types. But a country that took the more democratic Jeffersonian path, Switzerland, is often universally praised. Hoppe has praised Switzerland. Bill Lynn has praised Switzerland. So it's kind of strange how what they dislike about America is precisely the elements of the American system that are monarchical, and the parts that they like about Switzerland are precisely those elements of the American system that were democratic. What are some of your thoughts on that, Master Sanders?
Well, I think the genius of the Swiss system is because the Swiss system is born out of the Swiss experience. I mean, it's hard to have a central government that over a wide range of mountains as treacherous as the Alpines can be. And on top of that, it's much more convenient in terms of a direct democratic system, as in terms of small towns that are densely populated, much like they have there. So I think in the same way, the American system was born out of the American experience. And so I don't really think you could import the Swiss model to the United States, or at least without heavily modifying it. But going back to a broader question, I think on the Enlightenment, and Right Rumination sort of brought this up, and or this idea of the United States as an Enlightenment project. I think a lot of that goes back to reading back into the founders, even those that were quite a bit more educated on the issue of the Enlightenment, probably a lot more than was actually warranted. Not just by the attitudes of the time, but also by the American experience. I mean, there's nothing, at least in terms of 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was drafted, that Enlightenment thinking was inherently Republican. I mean, you did have a few that were in that direction, but up to that point, the Enlightenment would have been primarily a absolutist phenomenon. You had the idea of the enlightened despot, and many, or some, not all, but some Enlightenment thinkers were much more disposed toward a monarchical model. Whereas the Republican model that the United States adopted could arguably go back to America's number one practical experience when it comes to not just self governance, but some of its more puritanical, in the theological sense, attitudes, such as in New England. So New England was in many ways an effective republic for years prior to the American Revolution. So again, I do think that American republicanism as being a product of the Enlightenment has been quite exaggerated over the years, and it really comes down to a lot of them bringing up, or in the sense, a lot of it comes back to actually taking some of these thinkers at their word, or reading too much into the Declaration of Independence being written by one man as somehow being standard for the thinking of everybody involved in American independence.
Ruminations.
Well, I think that with respect to the role that the Enlightenment played in the American, you have people like you mentioned, Hitchens and Chomsky, siding with the radical Jeffersonian element, and I suppose claiming some kind of antecedent in the American Revolution. Whereas by contrast, you have reactionaries, including the libertarian reactionary Hoppe, who seem to prefer the side of the British to the Americans. There's a great irony in this, in that it seems to be a recurring theme in American history that whoever claims to be the radical is more conservative, whoever claims to be the conservative is more radical. And this goes back right to, well, first of all, it goes back to the Tories versus the Patriots, but it also goes back to the Federalists and the Republicans in the early. And this always kind of astounds me. I think it's rather bizarre that the Federalists or the Nationalists would regularly accuse the Jeffersonian Republicans of being Jacobins, of wanting to create a radical revolutionary situation where you had to be worried about people being dragged through the streets and the reign of terror and this kind of thing. And the reason that this, of course, is so bizarre is that it's actually the Federalists who supported the kind of centralized that the French Jacobins supported, where by contrast it was the Jeffersonian Republicans and Republicans in general who favored a relatively decentralized and system that was more emphatic on the divided nature of power, and to sort of compound the strangeness of this situation, it was actually the Republicans were more than happy to own up to the accusation and supported the French Revolution for a long time, even though politically, in terms of the political analogy, it would seem that the Federalists had more in common with the French, and the Republicans actually had less in common with them. And this is kind of in keeping with the theme of the more Whiggish side in the Revolution calling themselves, or being called, Tories, and the more Cokean element calling themselves Whigs. And this seems to have continued down to the present day, where you should have people like Hoppe and like Mencius Moldbug, should be favoring the American Revolution as a departure from parliamentary sovereignty. But for some reason, they're more inclined to favor the British system, which was in no way a reactionary system. And furthermore, you have the advocates of like Chomsky, of radical, centralized, in many ways Jacobin type political arrangements, who somehow fancy themselves as finding a forefather in Jefferson. So there's always this kind of upside down nature when it comes to the rhetoric of American radicalism versus conservatism and the actual practical realities of those two principles.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not unlike what we've discussed before, how there's this weird paleo-conservative fusion of Southern nationalism and economic protectionism, even though historically it was the American South that favored free trade and imperial expansion, and it was New England that favored protectionism and isolationism. So it's not new. It's just kind of odd. Master Sanders.
Yeah, it is. In a similar way, how populism went from being pro-free trade during the time of William Jennings Bryan in 1896 to pro-protectionism by the 1990s. So it is kind of interesting how those things shift. And I guess it's the paradox of American politics is that dating back all the way to the time just before the Revolution, you always did have to have this rather upside down understanding of politics, where the radicals are the actual conservatives, and the conservatives are the more radicals.
Yes, yes, and again, going back to the trajectory of American history, you could argue that under the Jeffersonian period, 1800 to Jefferson-Jacksonian period, 1800 to 1860, the more democratic interpretation of the Constitution was normative. But with Abraham Lincoln and the centralization of federal power, and then FDR and the what they call the imperial president, the sort of latent Hamiltonian monarchialism really started to assert itself. And again, I do find it odd that the elements of the U.S. political experience that are most monarchical are those that the monarchists invoke the most as evidence that the United States is terrible. And there seems to be a disconnect here somewhere. A rumination.
Yeah, I think that I've said what I have to say about that particular issue. I'm willing to pass the point on.
Okay. Master Sanders, anything you want to add?
Well, I do find it interesting is that how do we relate that to the present day? The hope that the monarch does have some sort of prerogative actually didn't die with the American Revolution. The latest example was in the late 1960s with the crisis in Rhodesia. If you read the unilateral Declaration of Independence that was issued by the Rhodesian government, which in many ways had a similar experience to the United States, they insisted that they were loyal subjects of the Queen. They appealed to her for help. They insisted that they were fighting against the ministry of Harold Wilson, much in the same way that the American colonists had insisted that they were fighting against the ministry of people like Grenville and others. And ultimately, in the end, the monarchy sided with with Wilson and the ministry, more so than with the people that were appealing to the monarchy. So, and of course, this was eventually realized in Rhodesia not long after, when they declared themselves to be a republic. But it is interesting to see how, even to the present, does seem to be an insistence that, or at least that argument of the king having, or the British monarchy having those prerogatives and appealing to those prerogatives, lasting much into the 20th century. And I think going on a broader point, which is probably beyond the scope of this stream, is maybe calling in the question if the goal of a movement is to sort of preserve the culture or certain elements of Western culture, if the monarchy in some of these modern Western countries is an effective solution at all when it comes to preserving those elements.
Now, in the sort of preliminary video that you created, right, Ruminations, for this discussion, you made a point that the Blackstonian system is flawed in the sense that it treats a historical artifact, the Parliament, as if it's a perennial law of nature. Um, and it seemed to me what you were saying was that the Kokia model was based more off of a convention, uh, and that the Blackstonian one was based on interpreting a historical accident as a law of nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, my thinking is that insofar as you're trying to determine an answer to the question that is the title of this stream, was the American Revolution legal? I think that, well, you have to, in looking at the two sides, ask, well, what is the common standard that they would have recognized as that which could judge their respective cases? And I think that while you might say, well, one doesn't have to care which side is legal, or that laws are simply in the eye of the beholder, or their meaning is simply in the eye of the beholder, I think that you can answer the question if you frame it as, well, by their own standard, who should have been on the correct side. And what I would say is that both the Blackstonians and the Kochians were speaking in relation to an immemorial parliament, or immemorial constitution. That is an ancient, unwritten constitution, which presumably it was just handed down as a matter of practice, and then dates back to before the Norman conquest. Now, whether one thinks that's true or not, or that has any plausibility, the point is that they believed that it did. And so the question is, which of the two interpretations, which of the two legal theories is most in keeping with that? And if you look at Coke's, the main thrust of it is that there has to be a kind of observation of these three principles of judicial, executive, and legislative. And the idea in the English common law that you can't say have legislation without representation. Well, that is something which may or may not have always been present, but it's certainly a lot more plausible to say that it might have been than it is to say that there was an immemorial parliament, which is the Blackstonian claim, because we now know what the establishing date for the English Parliament was. I think it was sometime in the 13th century, but the point is that it can be established. I think it was established by Edward II. I could be wrong about that, but anyhow, you take the meaning. And so, whereas by contrast, you do have things like the Baron War, which resulted in the Magna Carta, and some idea in kind of Germanic social arrangements of some idea of a common appeal or legal intermediary. So, in other words, it's not that either system is historically plausible. It's that if you're trying to determine which is more historically plausible, it's clearly the Kochian model, because it is absolutely incorrect that there was an immemorial parliament, and how can parliament be supreme in all its decisions in reference to an immemorial constitution if we have a founding date for parliament?
Master Sanders.
I don't think I necessarily have anything to add to that.
Okay. It seems like in answering your question, was the American Revolution legal? It kind of depends on which legal theory you accept. And I think that was kind of the point of bookmarking it between Koch and Blackstone. And really, if you look at, like, say, someone like Hoppe or other radical groups on the right, it really does more or less depend on what are your legal principles, your moral first principles. And so it's legal in relation to what? In one sense, you can argue, is it legal in relation to already existing English law? But part of the problem with common law is that it's based on procedure and repeated use. So sometimes there's a change which seems novel at the time, but over time, because it's continued in, it's considered normal.
Well, I just before I answer that, I want to make a correction. That somebody in the chat says that it was Edward the First who established Parliament. Yes, that's true. Edward the First is the villain in the Braveheart movie, and it's actually Edward the Second is his son, who in the movie's boyfriend gets thrown out the window. Anyhow, that's an aside. So yeah, Edward the First established English Parliament, or was established under him. So. Yeah, I agree with you that is the problem. That can it be demonstrated that the English common law was not intended to be updated by precedent over time, which is what I think people who are defending the English side would probably say, and this is a legitimate question, unlike with the American context. So, for example, James Madison claimed that he could erect a national bank because even though he had opposed it previously, a precedent had been set. Well, in the American context, Madison was horribly wrong because that's not a constitution based on precedent. It's based on written word. But in the British context, there's a question of, yes, if something's based on procedure, can a change in the procedure lead to a sort of re-cementing, as it were? And that, I suppose, would be the fundamental question, and Koch certainly did not think that it could. But it's not entirely clear to me that is really what the British were claiming at the time. It seems to me as if they were trying to find ways of explaining why, and this goes for Blackstone as well, why their current arrangement had always been the case, because they didn't come out and say the king is not sovereign or the king is limited in his power. What they did is they created this kind of legal, like, semantical trick called the king and parliament, which is still the current prevailing legal orthodoxy, which states that the king and parliament together can do nothing illicit. But at the same time, because the king is the king has absolute power as an expression of parliament, in a strange kind of way, he must there have no power, because the ultimate expression of his power is parliament. So it's hard to articulate, because I think it's mostly nonsense, but it's basically an outgrowth of what was going on since the Tudor period with Henry VIII, where the king and the parliament both have things that they want to achieve together. And so, but that they both are holding to this idea of sovereignty as indivisible. And so, in order to explain how the parliament and the king have powers, they have to kind of identify the king and the parliament as being the same thing. And I think that's kind of worked its way into English psychology, where to talk about parliament is somehow magically to talk about the king. And I think that that's more where their explanation lay, is that there's this idea of, well, yes, the king is the sovereign, and the king has his voice in parliament, and because it's in an immemorial parliament, and because the king has always been the sovereign, now we've come to this kind of full expression of the king's power in parliament. And it really doesn't have that much to do with precedent. It seems more to my thinking that they were not fully willing to depart from the idea of a kind of eternal legal arrangement. They just used a very fanciful way of describing it in order to get around the reality of the fact that they had actually changed the system, when they didn't want to admit that that's in fact what happened.
Master Sanders.
Going back to what he was, Right Ruminations was talking about the wonderful legal fiction that is the King and Parliament. They in Great Britain a couple months ago, they actually had a court case that dealt with this very issue. So, for example, when Boris Johnson was operating in a parliament where he clearly did not have a majority, he went to the Queen and asked for a prorogation in order to sort of get in, ostensibly to allow for Parliament to cool its heels, to have a Queen's speech, and to get everything ready for the government's upcoming agenda. Which he probably was at the time. He was to keep those that were supporting a Remain position from marshaling their forces and attempt some level to prevent the government from carrying out something like a no-deal Brexit or something on that order. Initially, there was a lawsuit leveled by several people saying that Boris Johnson could not do this. Boris Johnson's legal defense insisted that this was the Queen's prerogative. This was the Queen's government. She had the right to prorogue Parliament, even though on the advice of her Prime Minister. By the time it got to the Supreme Court, which in and of itself is a legal innovation in British law, the Supreme Court ruled that because Boris Johnson's prorogation was somehow frustrating or preventing, in their words, without reasonable justification, the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions, they said that the prorogation was somehow illegal, which is sort of bizarre because who is the one that ultimately prorogues Parliament, even if it's on the advice of the Prime Minister? Well, it's the Queen in this case. But according to the Supreme Court in Britain, it was the decision of the Prime Minister. So effectively, with this precedence, or any pretense of the Queen or the British monarchy in general having any level of power in Parliament, formal or otherwise, has effectively been vacated. And so it would be interesting to see if this charade of sort of the King or Queen in Parliament will even be considered in future legal analysis.
Yeah, nearing the end of the time, I think it's time to open up for final statements. So we'll start with you, at Ruminations.
There is not much more to say. I guess just to recap what has been said so that people can know the main takeaways, that the American Revolution was not a fight between republicanism and monarchy, but between two systems of English law, the Cokean model, which favored separation of powers, and the Blackstonian model, which was in vogue at the time and is still in vogue, which claims a sovereign and absolute role for Parliament. And in this sense, both the rhetoric and the framing on both sides of the royalists as traditionalist loyal Tories and the American revolutionaries as radical Jacobin Enlightenment Republicans are mostly for rhetorical and strategic effect. In this sense, the British side can be seen to be the more progressive or current side for its day, and the American revolutionaries, by consequence, were possessive of certain decidedly conservative elements. Although the conflict could probably best be described as a conflict between two types of liberalism. And if one is operating by their standards and claims of immemorial legal institutions, then while neither interpretation may be entirely plausible, the Blackstonian interpretation, because of the absence of an actual immemorial parliament, is decidedly impossible.
Okay, Master Sanders, final statement.
I think Right Ruminations probably has the best summary of our conversation. So.
All right. Well, thank you, at Ruminations. Thank you, Master Sanders. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly